My name is Correia. I'm an assistant professor at the Center for Latin American Studies here at the University of Florida, obviously. And Penelope Anthias is coming from Durham University, and she's part of the Masters in Latin American Studies Indigenous Studies speaker series that we started this year. We had Nancy Postero, who was talking about Bolivia earlier in the semester here. Penelope will also be talking about a different aspect of Bolivian politics and indigeneity and indigenous issues as well. And then on April 24th, which is technically the last day of classes, so hopefully you have actually some free time, we have a pretty incredible workshop that is kind of like the crescendo of this speaker series as well, where we'll have some Afro-Colombian women coming from Buenaventura, Colombia. We have two representatives of the Sarayaku indigenous community from Ecuador coming. And we also have a couple people from Paraguay coming as well. And they'll be talking about different issues from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights to Kausaksacha. I always mispronounce it. Kausaksacha, an initiative that the Sarayaku community is implementing and moving forward to rethink relations with nature on a broad scale and kind of share their vision of rights of nature and arguments about rights of nature more broadly. So they have a really organized and interesting initiative that they're going to be talking about as well. And then the women from Buenaventura, Colombia will talk about their organizing and mobilizing efforts to shut down through a paro cívico, a broad general strike in the town of Buenaventura, and they'll talk about how that's kind of changed relationships with the state. So Penelope's talk fits within this because we've been thinking about and talking a lot about questions around decolonization, indigeneity, territory, what that all means, and thinking about it in different ways through these series of talks. And so we're really excited to have Penelope here. This is her most recent book, which was published by Cornell University Press in 2018. She also has a number of peer-reviewed journal articles in Geoforum, Latin American Perspectives, among other book chapters as well. She's coordinating a special issue in Geoforum on ethnicity, territory, governmentality, and decolonization, which should be very exciting, I think. And we were just together up in Washington, D.C. at the American Association of Geographers Conference, where we also talked about this book and among many other things. So it's really a pleasure to have you all the way from Durham, England, here at the University of Florida. So let's give Penelope a big welcome. And I want to acknowledge as well the time and energy of Maggie Martinez, Patricia Alva, the support from the Center for Latin American Studies, the support from the Department of Anthropology, which generously provided the sugar and caffeine, as well as the Multicultural and Diversity Affairs for giving us this space to use today. So after the talk, Penelope is looking forward to an open conversation with everybody and a discussion. So we're looking forward to seeing what you have to say and how this is moving your thinking forward. So without further ado, thanks so much. And again, pass it over to Penelope.
Well, thanks very much, Joel, for that introduction and for inviting me to be here, and also to all the people who helped make this visit happen. It's great to see such a full house, and especially so many students here today. So what I'm going to give you today is kind of an overview of my book, Limits to Decolonization. And I hope we're going to also have time for some discussion and questions at the end. Joel said, you know, this is Penelope's latest book. It's actually my first and only book.
Well, we're hoping for another one. We're hoping for another one. So.
Cornell University Press, and it's the first in a new land series there. So, Limits to Decolonization tells the story of one Indigenous group's recent struggle to regain control of their ancestral territory through a collective territorial claim. The book charts their frustrating engagements with the collective mapping and land titling process, their growing disillusionment with the leftist government, and the emergence of a new vision of territorial autonomy based on Indigenous control of gas rents. And what I basically argue in the book is that Indigenous peoples' encounters with the limits of a politics of recognition associated with the land titling process, both during the neoliberal period and under the government of Evo Morales, is shaping their participation in new forms of what I call hydrocarbon citizenship, where recognition and political autonomy are intimately linked to the governance of the subsoil. So I hope this is going to make more sense as I continue with my talk. So I'm going to begin today by outlining three intersecting contexts for the book. Then I'm going to talk a bit about what I call the limits to decolonization and what kind of theoretical perspectives help me understand those limits. And I'm also then going to give you a brief snapshot of this new kind of ideas of hydrocarbon citizenship. And then if there's time, I'm going to also conclude by briefly reflecting on the kind of political and ethical dilemmas that I think the book raises, both for me personally and for critical academic scholarship more broadly. Part one is the decolonial struggle. So Limits to Decolonization tells the story of 36 Guaraní indigenous communities located in Bolivia's remote and gas-rich Chaco region to regain rights to and control of their ancestral territory. Located in the southeast of Bolivia, the Chaco region is home to 3 indigenous groups, and it's long been at the imaginative and political frontiers of the Bolivian nation-state. So the Chaco is really this whole area here, and the territory where I'm working, Iquiwasu, is that little triangle that you can see. The Guaraní, who are the largest indigenous group of the Bolivian lowlands, successfully defended their extensive Chaco territory, first from the Inca, then from the Spanish, and then from the Bolivian Republican forces until the late 19th century, so more than half a century after Bolivian independence. The 1892 Correia massacre is widely seen as marking the effective end to Guaraní military resistance. This massacre took place when the Guaraní prophet, Apiawaiki Tumpa, had gathered thousands of followers from throughout the region to perform religious rites. The rape and murder of a Guaraní woman by a Bolivian state official sparked a conflict during which Republican forces killed approximately 8,000 Guaraní fighters. And the remaining fighters and women and children were captured and distributed as slaves to Christian or Spanish settlers. While the prophet Tumpa was captured and impaled on a long pike, displayed for 24 hours in the public square of Monteagudo, and then drawn, quartered, and burned. So I mention this event because I think it really illustrates how the seeking of Bolivian national sovereignty in the Chaco has rested on the symbolic erasure and violent subjugation of its indigenous inhabitants. So a century after the Correia massacre saw successive waves of dispossession of indigenous communities as an expanding cattle ranching economy was accompanied by state policies that awarded land to non-indigenous settlers. The beginning of hydrocarbon development in the 1930s and the disastrous Chaco War over their control led to further settlement in indigenous lands, and Bolivia's 1952 agrarian reform, which is widely associated with actually breaking up haciendas in the Bolivian highlands, had the opposite effect in the Chaco, leading to a formalization of settler rights and the spread of a form of indigenous debt peonage, known locally as empadronamiento. So by the late 20th century, most Guaraní communities in the Chaco were trapped in forms of semi-slavery on non-indigenous haciendas, where they were subject to routine forms of violence, racialized abuse, and an absolute denial of citizenship rights. As the Guaraní authors of one account recall, we worked day and night without eating, enduring cold, rain and heat to be able to survive in these lands, so that our sons began to speak Spanish, our daughters no longer wore the tipoy. Some were even obliged to give up the music of the arete. We always went around humble and silent because all these carai, which is non-indigenous settlers, ever said was those chawancos, those ava, those kumpa, these are always all kind of racialized insults, are too lazy to work, without realizing that thanks to our labours they had trucks and new money, becoming richer and richer, while we who lived for years working became poorer and poorer and had to die finally without leaving anything to our children. So for anybody who's worked in the South American lowlands, or indeed in many kind of indigenous areas, this kind of story will not seem unusual. But I think it represents a kind of crucial starting point for understanding what's at stake for the Guaraní in their struggle for territory. This has to be understood, I argue, as a decolonial struggle in which land rights were a means to a broader set of goals, regaining control over their bodies and territory, restoring ways of being that had been eroded by a century of colonisation, and becoming what they call iambai, which means in Guaraní free or without, literally without an owner. So Guaraní communities of the Chaco began organising in the late 1980s in the context of region-wide processes of indigenous organising across the Bolivian lowlands. They began by occupying hacienda land, renegotiating contracts with hacienda bosses, and forming maize farming cooperatives. In 1989, they formed their own organisation, the Guaraní People's Assembly of Iticahuasu, or the APG Iticahuasu, affiliated with a national Guaraní organisation. And shortly afterwards, they began mapping out a territorial claim to present to the Bolivian state. They did so on the basis that without secure access to land on which to grow maize and other crops, they would be forced to return to work with the patrones, the hacienda bosses. So if the struggle for territory in Iticahuasu emerged from a specific regional history of indigenous dispossession and resurgence, then it also has to be understood in the context of much broader kind of shifting forms of liberal multicultural governance. So beginning in the 1970s, the global indigenous rights movement helped bring about a shift in approach towards indigenous people among global development institutions. Replacing earlier assimilationist approaches, a new multicultural vision argued that indigenous people should be allowed to develop according to their own cultural values and priorities. And this shift was reflected in the ILO, International Labour Organization's Convention 169, passed in 1989, which called for a respect for the cultural integrity of indigenous peoples, their co-participation in national society and development decisions, and recognition of their territorial rights. And during the 1990s, major development institutions, notably the World Bank, began actively promoting and financing legal mechanisms for recognising indigenous land rights, which were framed as a necessary kind of condition for achieving what was called ethno-development. And there was also an argument that indigenous land rights were kind of going to help strengthen indigenous peoples' possible role in biodiversity conservation. So by 2008, Latin American states, largely with World Bank financing, had recognised indigenous and Afro-descendant tenure rights to some 200 million hectares of land, an area slightly larger than Mexico. So it was in this context that Bolivia's native community lands, Tierras Comunitarias de Origen, or TCOs, were created under Bolivia's 1996 INRA law, an agrarian reform law that was sponsored and overseen by the World Bank. Drawing on the text of ILO Convention 169, the INRA law defines TCOs as the geographical spaces that constitute the habitat of indigenous and originary peoples and communities to which they have traditionally had access and where they maintain and develop their own forms of economic, social and cultural organisation in a way that guarantees their survival and development. So in fact, as chapter 1 of the book documents, the creation of TCOs was not just a kind of top-down policy process, but rather TCOs were the outcome of a decade-long struggle by Bolivia's lowland indigenous movement, marked by a series of national marches, as well as local processes of indigenous and activist countermapping. As such, I think we have to understand TCOs as an example of how indigenous peoples struggled and succeeded in inserting their own historically grounded demands for territory within an evolving and contested development agenda. But I want to just say something more here about the neoliberal context in which these struggles unfolded. So the geographer Tom Perot has defined neoliberalism as an economic and political project that seeks to liberalise trade, privatise state-controlled industries and services, and introduce market-oriented management practices to a reduced public sector. So we're kind of talking about privatising reforms. Like most Latin American countries, Bolivia experienced neoliberal reforms in the context of structural adjustment loans provided by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank beginning in the mid-1980s. These reforms included a privatisation Yeah. So these reforms included the privatisation of Bolivia's hydrocarbon sector, which opened up Bolivia's oil and gas fields to investment by transnational companies. I should say here that natural gas represents the kind of main source of income now for the Bolivian state, having surpassed mining, which was historically the most important. 85% of these gas reserves are located in the Chaco region of Tarija Department. So this is Tarija Department here, this area, where many of these gas reserves lie within indigenous territories. The ambivalent relationship between indigenous land rights and neoliberalism has been discussed by other scholars, most notably Charles Hale, who sees indigenous land rights as emblematic of a neoliberal multicultural paradigm where indigenous peoples are being granted limited forms of cultural recognition in an effort to contain resistance to a broader neoliberal economic project. And indeed, some of the World Bank's earliest statements on indigenous land rights came within its 1982 Operational Policy Statement 2.34, which identifies indigenous land rights as one of several safeguards to protect tribal peoples in the context of bank-funded development projects, which include extractive industry. But what the directive's text made clear is that what is in fact being protected here is also the legal and political security of these capital investments. So inspired by these critiques of neoliberal multiculturalism, a key aim of my research was to examine how indigenous land rights intersect with hydrocarbon geographies in practice. So kind of going beyond a kind of critique of the governmental intentions to really look at how this plays out on the ground. And this is basically why I selected the Chaco region of Tarija Department as my research site. When I arrived in Tarija in 2008, Tarija was at the height of a boom in natural gas development triggered by the neoliberal reforms of the 1980s and 1990s. The territory of Iticahuasu, the subject of this book, overlies Bolivia's biggest gas field, Campo Margarita, which has been developed by the Spanish oil company Repsol since 1997, notably the same year that the territory was formally recognised as a native community land. So in this context, the book critically interrogates the possibilities and limits of indigenous land rights as a decolonial strategy. And in doing so, it speaks to broader debates around the politics of recognition for indigenous peoples, as well as critical evaluations of indigenous countermapping as a kind of liberatory practice. But it goes beyond some of the kind of previous critiques of countermapping to really look at, beyond the representational limit of maps, how do these claims play out kind of in the longer term, and how do they articulate with kind of capitalist geographies. So the third context, post-neoliberal state, I think what makes this case particularly complex and particularly interesting is that this struggle for territory has unfolded against the backdrop of a momentous process of social and political change in Bolivia following the 2005 election of President Evo Morales. A former coca growers union leader, Evo Morales rose to power, as many scholars have documented, on a wave of popular discontent with 2 decades of neoliberal reform, which had impoverished many ordinary Bolivians while disproportionately benefiting transnational companies. And here you can just see 2 of the kind of most important social mobilizations which led up to Morales' election. The water war in Cochabamba, which responded to the privatization of that city's water supply, and then in 2003, the gas war in El Alto, where people called for a renationalization of Bolivia's hydrocarbon reserves. So Morales began his presidency by nationalizing the country's gas fields, greatly increasing state royalties from extraction. And this money's been channeled into a range of social programs targeting poor and disadvantaged sectors. This includes programs or cash transfer programs for expectant mothers, school children, and the elderly. So this model is emblematic of what's been called in the literature a neo-extractivist development model, implemented across a number of Latin American states during the recent oil boom. But Morales' process of change was about much more than a kind of new economic regime. Emphasising his own indigenous roots, Morales also promised to decolonise the state and society. On assuming office, he immediately convoked a constituent assembly comprised of representatives from indigenous and peasant organisations who were tasked with rewriting the Bolivian constitution. The resulting document is probably the most radical statement of indigenous rights ever created by a nation-state. And it redefines Bolivia as a plurinational state that recognises indigenous peoples' rights to territory and to autonomy. So since Morales took office, Bolivia has been at the forefront of academic and activist debates around decolonisation and the construction of political alternatives to neoliberalism. Over time, the initial optimism of much of this leftist scholarship has given way to a more sober analysis, which has pointed to the gap between state discourse and practice regarding indigenous and environmental rights, creeping authoritarian tendencies, and the aggressive pursuit of resource extraction. But to date, much of the recent kind of scholarship on Bolivia under Morales has been written from a quite state-centric perspective, so kind of starting from the discourses and practices of the government. By retelling this history through the experiences of 36 Guaraní communities of Itikawasu, this book offers a different kind of account. I argue that the experiences of indigenous people living at Bolivia's resource frontiers shed important light on the dynamics and the contradictions of Morales' process of change, highlighting important continuities in relations between indigenous peoples, state power, and resource extraction, which are sometimes hidden in kind of macro-level institutional analysis. So to summarise, based on these kind of intersecting contexts, two of the main questions that this book addresses are: to what extent can indigenous land rights contribute to struggles for decolonisation, and what are the implications of Morales' process of change for indigenous peoples, or as I put here, how has Morales' process of change reconfigured relationships between indigenous peoples, territory, and extraction? And I've sought to answer these questions ethnographically based on a multi-sited methodology which has combined extensive participant observation, interviews, documentary analysis, and some participatory methods. And I'll be happy to talk more about my methods in the question and answer session. So this brings me to the kind of crux of my argument, the limits to decolonisation. So during the course of their territorial claim, the Guaraní have encountered a series of limits. These limits are epistemological, they're geographical, political, and material. In negotiating a new land law, indigenous people in Bolivia saw their ancestral rights subjugated to private property and to hydrocarbon concessions. In mapping their territorial claim, the Guaraní Itikawasu were required to kind of slot this territory into an already mapped world of state and settler geographies. During the land titling process, they witnessed the limits of state law to confront landowners who were prepared to defend their property claims with violence. In a decade-long conflict with a transnational oil company, they also saw the limited capacity of maps and land titles to guarantee indigenous people's territorial control. But throughout the book, I also try and show how the Guaraní have contested and worked within these limits in defence of their own vision of territorial autonomy, through local negotiations with landowners, in meetings with state institutions, through their everyday territorial practices, and in negotiations with oil companies. So this book doesn't really offer a kind of redemptive narrative of indigenous resistance, but rather it's a story about constrained forms of agency, about endurance against the odds. Or as indigenous scholar Audra Simpson argues, about how indigenous struggles take place in the teeth of empire. So I want to say something now about the kind of approaches that have informed my interrogation of these limits to decolonization. So my work builds on the insights of post-colonial and decolonial scholarship, which draws attention to the persistence of colonial knowledges and power relations in the present, and the difficulties this poses for subaltern groups seeking recognition. Post-colonial geographers have drawn attention to the ambivalences surrounding Indigenous peoples' engagements with cartography and property, knowledge practices that are predicated on the erasure and violent dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their territories. Latin American decolonial scholars have also talked about the coloniality of state power in Latin America, again highlighting how this kind of subjugates Indigenous epistemologies and sovereignties. And I've also increasingly been drawn to literature in settler colonial studies, which, among other things, highlights the intimate relationship between race and property. For example, by showing how notions of ownership are linked to racialized identities and understandings of productive land use. So, in the book, I combine these insights with work by legal anthropologists who've shown how global discourses of rights and national legal norms become vernacularized in the context of local understandings of rights and justice. So they kind of become adapted in place. So what I argue is that for Indigenous land claimants in the Bolivian Chaco, such as the Guaraní of Anthias, this process of vernacularizing law involved the reproduction of a colonial geography of rights, or what Correia has recently called a racialized regime of ownership. So, to be more specific, when the land reform agency INRA entered the territory of Itikawasu in the year 2000 to begin measuring properties, officials were met with strong and sometimes violent resistance from local land claimants, and particularly those who previously depended on having control of free Indigenous labour to make their hacienda properties viable, the patrones, who of course were still there in the territory. In the subsequent stages of the titling process, extremely kind of bureaucratic, private claimants presented written complaints to state agencies, they made legal challenges, obstructed the release of departmental funds for titling, and they used their personal and family contacts within the Land Reform Agency to disappear or modify legal documents. These strategies drew on clientelistic networks of ethnic power within the regional context of Tarifa, where state institutions remain in the hands of non-Indigenous landowning groups. So it's important to remember here that, until the 1980s, Indigenous people like the Guaraní were not recognised as citizens, and so, of course, state power in this area has very much been in the control of settlers and landowning groups. These actions by landowners were underpinned by racialized notions of productive land use, which framed the Guaraní as unproductive and therefore undeserving of property rights. As one private claimant told me, the Guaraní only say, "It's my territory." They don't sow, they don't have a hacienda. I believe that land should be for people who fulfill a social function. So in my interviews with landowners, this was very much one of the kind of prevalent discourses. And in fact, it was shared by the state officials who were responsible for implementing this titling process. The departmental director of INRA admitted to me in an interview that he did not himself agree with the principle of Indigenous land rights. As he put it, "I think that all sectors without distinction should be required to use the land. You can't justify that a people have so much unproductive land. It doesn't serve any purpose. They're going to be a threat to society." So, you can see here a complete kind of lack of recognition of Indigenous forms of land use and the way in which this kind of underpins the denial of their claims to property rights. Private land claimants, many of whom are descendants of soldiers who fought in the Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay in the 1930s, also argued that they had earned land rights through their ancestors' contribution to processes of nation building in the Chaco War. As one rancher told me, "My grandfather was an ex-combatant in the Chaco War. He returned missing an eye with a bullet in the lung, which 30 years ago cost him his life. I, as a grandson, I also consider myself native," don't you think? So there's a kind of, sorry, I put the wrong, this clicker is doing strange things. So that was the slide. That's just a picture of Bolivian Chaco War with quotation. So there's a kind of competing narrative about native status being something that has been earned through participation in previous processes of nation building, and here there's a kind of erasure of the way in which Chaco indigenous peoples themselves participated in the Chaco War and suffered kind of massive displacement as a result of that. So these sedimented articulations of race, property and state power in the Bolivian Chaco have been shaken but not unseated by the government of Evo Morales, which has ultimately established its own power in the region through alliances with landowning elites who compete with indigenous peoples for control of land in TCOs. And a key example of this is the gentleman who this quote is taken from. I first met him as the president of the Cattle Ranchers Association that was kind of leading opposition to the TCO claim. He is now the regional or provincial governor of the entire province representing the mass party. So this is a kind of illustration of the kind of way in which state power continues to be made through these similar types of alliances. So a second body of scholarship that really informs my analysis of the limits to decolonization is political ecology. Since its inception in the 1970s, political ecology has really been concerned with how local conflicts around land and resources are shaped by broader relations of political economy at a variety of scales. This has included work on how extractive industry reconfigures property rights and land relations in sites of extraction, as well as the kind of inequalities and conflicts that gives rise to. So I argue in the book that hydrocarbon interests have played a defining role in shaping the outcomes of the Itikawasu TCO claim. But what perhaps stands out most here is not just the way in which capitalist interests reconfigure space, but how they actually articulate with this racialized regime of ownership that I've already talked about. So, to give you an example, in chapter 5 of the book, I talk about how the oil company Repsol negotiated land use agreements with non-indigenous property claimants within TCO Itikawasu in an effort to achieve legal security for its operations while bypassing the Guaraní organisation. These land use agreements were then used as evidence of productive land use, or what under the INRA law is called the economic social function of property, and they were used then to justify private rights to properties that would otherwise have been or should have been allocated to the Guaraní. So in other words, the process that Gavin Bridge has talked about as fixing the whole, so the way that oil companies and investors kind of achieve legal security for the specific pieces of land they need to access the subsoil, has been achieved by fixing the rights of non-indigenous landowners who'd acquired their properties, of course, from a history of state-backed indigenous dispossession and at a time when indigenous people's property rights were not recognised. At a more general level, Guaraní leaders in Itikawasu have ultimately become convinced that state interests in gas reserves in their territory are the ultimate obstacle to legal progress implementing their land rights. This narrative first emerged in the neoliberal period, so prior to Morales' election, but it's become more pervasive under the government of Evo Morales, where the Guaraní and other indigenous groups have found their territorial claims to be at odds with the state project of decolonization built on the extraction of resources from these lands. As the president of the APG Itikowasu argued in an assembly in 2009, the bottleneck issue for the TCO claim isn't that there are social conflicts. That isn't the fear. The bottleneck that exists here now is that the government have constitutionalised the consultation process. The bottleneck is investment in energy development to export overseas. That's the problem of this government. If I were the president, I'd do the same, compañeros. Why give them the title if it's going to bring conflicts to fulfil commitments of energy development overseas? The government exports gas, oil from our territories and without consulting us. So it's better for the government to continue delaying the titling process because then they can evade responsibilities and continue doing energy development in all of our territory. So he's really referring here to the ways in which, on the one hand, under the Morales government, indigenous territorial rights have been strengthened, but at the same time that kind of creates additional disincentives for the government to kind of fully legalise indigenous land claims. Such statements underscore the contradictions of the mass government's promise to create a plurinational state with indigenous autonomies while pursuing an economic model based on the extraction of gas reserves located in indigenous territories. And so here, the title of the book, Limits to Decolonization, can be kind of read as a critique of the mass government's own discourse of decolonization. And that's definitely how it's going to be read in the Bolivian context, where decolonization has become more or less synonymous with a kind of statist project. But more broadly, the title also highlights the limits that a hydrocarbon economy places on decolonial struggles at sites of extraction. And I think there's a kind of connection here to Tim Mitchell's much more brilliant book, Carbon Democracy, if anybody's kind of looked at that. But what's perhaps most surprising in this story that I tell is the way in which Guaraní leaders in Itikowasu have responded to these limits to decolonization by reframing their territorial project in the context of hydrocarbon governance. And I'm going to just read you here a kind of brief vignette from chapter 6 of my book as an example of this. So it was March the 23rd, 2011, and I was standing on the scrubby ground of the central courtyard of Nyaurenda community, where people from the 36 Guaraní communities of Itikowasu had gathered to celebrate the 22nd anniversary of their organisation. It was here that grandparents had begun organising in the late 1980s to free themselves from a regime of debt peonage on local haciendas. My friend Santiago was just old enough to remember the fervour of those early assemblies, when charismatic leaders had galvanised communities to join the struggle for territory. He contrasted his memories with a muted atmosphere of this year's anniversary. Most of the audience sat silently through the previous evening's cultural event. When at midnight 22 fireworks exploded, there was little response. In his anniversary speech, the president of the APG Itikowasu attempted to lift the mood. He told community members, "This year's anniversary is not like any other. It's a very special year that we will forever remember." He went on December the 29th, we signed an agreement with Repsol, which put an end to the difficult confrontation that we've maintained for many years. But we signed without renouncing any of our rights and gained full legal recognition of our property over the native community land. He went on to list the terms of the agreement, which included the creation of a $14.8 million Itikowasu investment fund to be managed independently by the Guaraní organization. This fund, he explained, is part of our long-term financing strategy, which will allow us to progress in our own development. This guarantees our true autonomy and that of our children. So this speech reflects the emergence of a new vision of territory and autonomy among the Guaraní leadership of Itikowasu. In contrast to the notion of territory as a space inhabited by ancestors or where communities currently live out their lives, territory had come to signify the legal political jurisdiction of the Guaraní organization, as defined in relation to extraterritorial actors. So territorial recognition here was to be achieved through hydrocarbon negotiations rather than through the official state land titling process, while territorial autonomy was linked to indigenous control of gas rents. And I should perhaps mention that the year before this agreement was signed, the leadership actually demanded the indefinite suspension of the land titling process. So in the final chapter of the book, I use the term hydrocarbon citizenship to describe the ways in which notions of recognition, authority and rights in Tikawasu are being reconceptualized and re-territorialized in relation to the governance of hydrocarbons. While other Bolivianist scholars have highlighted the intimate relationship between hydrocarbons and nation in Morales' Bolivia, my analysis sheds light on how local actors articulate hydrocarbons and citizenship from the ground up. So this poster that I just put up here on the slide is a poster made by the Guaraní leadership here in 2014, and it kind of expresses, the meaning of this new vision. So just to point out a few things, they describe themselves, the APG Tikawasu, as being the property owners of the TCO, and this is not through having achieved property rights from the state, but rather through the agreement with Repsol. And while the legal term for native community lands, tierras comunitarias de origen, they've renamed it here as territorial comunitario de origen, or in native community territories, in an attempt to kind of show how they're defying the limits of the land titling process and trying to capture the political kind of content of territory. They've also put here hacia la tierra sin mal y la autonomía indígena, so towards the land without evil, which is a kind of Guaraní concept of land struggle, and indigenous autonomy. And the pictures show various types of development which they foresee being funded by this Tikawasu investment fund. So we've got kind of healthcare for expectant mothers and tractors for maize production, among other things. So it's important to point out that this vision of gas-funded autonomy is deeply contested in Tikawasu and has generated a kind of many years of conflict. And in fact, around this time, 2014, a rival Guaraní leadership emerged in the same territory. But rather than seeing a kind of return of the older visions of what territory meant, this rival leadership instead sees the future of the TCO as it being kind of inserted in state-led forms of gas rents distribution. So the picture on the right here shows an electrification program or project being implemented in the territory where I spent 6 months. And so this is kind of, I think this illustrates how, hydrocarbon-based development creates, what Brett Gustafson has called competing modes of spatial practice. So on the one hand, there's a vision of territorial autonomy and sovereignty associated with the struggle for the TCO. On the other hand, there's the promise of being integrated in these state-led forms of economic redistribution. But what's important is that both of these visions are very much firmly grounded in a kind of extractivist development vision. But ultimately, kind of what I argue in the book is that we have to understand the emergence of these visions, not just as kind of, rent-seeking behaviour by Indigenous peoples, but as a response to the limits of recognition encountered over the previous 2 decades of struggle for the TCO. So just to briefly conclude, in her 2007 book, Now We Are Citizens, the anthropologist Nancy Postero argued that Morales' election in Bolivia was the result of indigenous and peasant peoples' efforts to move beyond the limited forms of cultural recognition offered by the neoliberal multicultural reforms of the 1990s towards a kind of redistribution of power and resources. So in this book I read Guaraní engagements in hydrocarbon citizenship as part of a similar movement. While the mass government has redistributed gas wealth through its social programmes, when it comes to indigenous claims to territory, the gap between recognition and resource control has persisted, particularly for gas-rich territories like Tikawasu. the seeming impossibility of achieving land rights in the context of enduring alignments between landowners, the state, and capital has led some Guaraní leaders to see direct negotiations with hydrocarbon companies as an alternative arena for achieving recognition and resource sovereignty. So I think this kind of argument really sits within broader ongoing discussions about not only the limits of the politics of recognition for Indigenous peoples, but the diverse ways in which Indigenous peoples kind of respond to those limits. It also very much shows what Michael Watts has argued, that extractive industry and what he calls Faustian bargains over sovereignty produce new kinds of governable spaces. And I think what I've really tried to show in the book is that this isn't just a question of kind of capitalist interests remaking space, but that those new governable spaces have to be understood in the context of much longer struggles over post-colonial citizenship and recognition. I mean, I don't want to talk too much longer, but I just briefly want to say something about kind of where this book has taken me on a personal level. We're at the moment in academic scholarship where there's a lot of emphasis in literature on Indigenous peoples on making visible the existence of different ontologies or different kind of ways of being. And that there is, I mean, I agree that there's a real kind of important politics in making visible those other worlds, and perhaps that by writing about other worlds we can help bring them into being. But I think there's also, a place for critical scholarship that also interrogates the limits of, and exposes the limits that the colonial present places on the emergence of those other worlds. And to me, what I've really learned in Itikawasu about the way that our kind of hydrocarbon capitalism places constraints on what the Guaraní can achieve kind of brings me to reflect more deeply on my own kind of position within these territorial assemblages, including, and not least, academic travel, which includes taking many different flights. So this is just some kind of photos to end with, me not looking very happy on a recent flight to attend an academic meeting. This is a youth climate strike that happened in the city where I live, Newcastle, as part of a new movement called Extinction Rebellion. And this is a photo, an aerial photo of the Margarita gas fields in Guaraní. So thanks very much for listening.